Someone called me asking that I help him with enough money for him to buy land. That was a big ask. I did not have the ability, so I just told the person that I am not able to do so. So have you ever been asked for help? Someone asked you to help them in a way that was beyond your ability to help? Kindly tell us what that was in the comments section. Genesis chapter 30, the precious word of God says, "Now, when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said to Jacob, 'Give me children, or else I die.' And Jacob's anger was aroused against Rachel. And he said, 'Am I in the place of God, who has withheld you from the fruit of the womb?' So she said, 'Here is my maid Bilhah. Go in to her, and she will bear a child on my knees, that I also may have children by her.' Then she gave him Bilhah her maid as wife, and Jacob went in to her. And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, 'God has judged my case, and she has also heard my voice and given me a son.' Therefore she called his name Dan. And Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, 'With great wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and indeed I have prevailed.' So she called his name Naphtali. When Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, she took Zilpah her maid and gave her to Jacob as wife. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, 'A troop comes.' So she called his name Gad. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Then Leah said, 'I am happy, for the daughters will call me blessed.' So she called his name Asher. Now Reuben went in the days of wheat harvest and found mandrakes in the field, and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, 'Please give me some of your son's mandrakes.' But she said to her, 'Is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also?' And Rachel said, 'Therefore he will lie with you tonight for your son's mandrakes.' When Jacob came out of the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, 'You must come in to me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes.' And he lay with her that night. And God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Leah said, 'God has given me my wages, because I have given my maid to my husband.' So she called his name Issachar. Then Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a sixth son. And Leah said, 'God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will dwell with me, because I have borne him 6 sons.' So she called his name Zebulun. Afterward she bore a daughter, and called her name Dinah. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. And she conceived and bore a son, and said, 'God has taken away my reproach.' So she called his name Joseph, and said, 'The Lord shall add to me another son.' And it came to pass, when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said to Laban, 'Send me away, that I may go to my own place and to my country. Give me my wives and my children, for whom I have served you, and let me go, for you know my service which I have done for you.' And Laban said to him, 'Please stay, if I have found favor in your eyes, for I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake.' Then he said, 'Name me your wages, and I will give it.' So Jacob said to him, 'You know how I have served you, and how your livestock has been with me. For what you had before I came was little, and it has increased to a great amount. The Lord has blessed you since my coming, And now, when shall I also provide for my own house? So he said, what shall I give you? And Jacob said, you shall not give me anything. If you will do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep your flocks. Let me pass through all your flocks today, removing from there all the speckled and spotted sheep, and all the brown ones among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and these shall be my wages. So my righteousness will answer for me in time to come, when the subject of my wages comes before you. Everyone that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and brown among the lambs will be considered stolen, if it is with me. And Laban said, oh, that it were according to your word. So he was happy. So he removed that day the male goats that were speckled and spotted, all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, everyone that had some white in it, and all the brown ones among the lambs, and gave them into the hand of his sons. Then he put 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. Now Jacob took for himself rods of green poplar and of the almond and chestnut trees, peeled white strips in them, and exposed the white which was in the rods. And the rods which he had peeled he set before the flocks in the gutters, in the watering troughs where the flocks came to drink, so that they should conceive when they came to drink. So the flocks conceived before the rods, and the flocks brought forth streaked, speckled, and spotted. Then Jacob separated the lambs and made the flocks face toward the streaked and all the brown in the flock of Laban, but he put his own flocks by themselves and did not put them with Laban's flock. And it came to pass, whenever the stronger livestock conceived, that Jacob placed the rods before the eyes of the livestock in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. But when the flocks were feeble, he did not put them in. So the feebler were Laban's, and the stronger Jacob's. Thus the man became exceedingly prosperous, and had large flocks, female and male servants, and camels and donkeys. May the Lord bless the reading of his word. So Genesis chapter 30, it's a wonderful chapter. Again, we see Jacob still trying his tricks. And he has learned that Laban is not also a small one. So he's trying to compete with that. So in verse 1 and 2, we see Rachel asking Jacob for a very difficult thing. Give me a child. She says, give me children or else I die. That's a difficult thing to ask for. So Jacob is angry, Jacob is frustrated, because he knows that it is only God who gives children, and at this point, it is God who has closed her womb. So this question, this thing that Rachel is demanding from Jacob, reminds us that there are times we run to people for solutions instead of running to God. And then when we run to men, they are not able to solve our problems. Or if they are, then that takes us away from God, from trusting Him and waiting on Him. Have you been running to people for solutions instead of to God? Rachel is asking something that her husband of something that he cannot give. She's desperate. She's not having children. And even in many cultures, when a woman is not able to bear children, it is seen as a great failure, and she feels not a woman enough. And it's not something good to be in. So the two ladies, the two wives, Leah and Rachel, are competing for the love of their husband through giving him children. They're like, the more children I give him, the more he will love me. And this prayer of Rachel, this request, give me children or else I die, reminds me of John Knox. John Knox was one of the greatest prayer warriors of the Reformation. He is known for crying out to God and praying, give me Scotland, Lord, or I die. That was his prayer. And I think it was fashioned from this request of Rachel here in verse 1. Give me Scotland, Lord, or I die. Now the Queen Mary of the Scots was one of his largest oppositions in his ministry. And she said to have said one day that I fear John Knox's prayers more than all the assembled armies of Europe. Imagine. What if we were that passionate about the glory of God among his people? What if we were that passionate about God's glory being revealed in the nations and the people groups of the world? Because he's praying, Lord, give me Scotland or I die. He wants people to turn to Christ, to know him in Scotland. That was his prayer. May we be that passionate. In verse 3 and 8, we see Rachel's solution. I mean, she's like, now my husband cannot be able to give me children, I cannot bear children. So she promotes Bilhah, her maid, to the position of third wife. She promotes Bilhah to be the third wife, and she gives her away to Jacob and said, give me children, using this through this lady. So getting children on behalf of someone was an acceptable culture among the Jews. Then she said in verse 3, let her bear children on my niece. What does that mean, bearing children on my niece? It is simply the practice of women. It is simply the practice of a woman offering her servant to her husband to have children through the servant. So when the child is born, they will be recognized. They will be adopted. And they will be like her own children. It will be like she's the one who has born the children through the maid. So she will recognize and adopt those children as her own. So she does this. Now the birthing custom among the Jews was that when a child was born, it was usually placed on the knees, or what we would call today the lap. When a child is born, the child was placed on the lap of the father or the mother, the parents. And that was to show that the baby belongs to that person. So that is the meaning, bearing children on my niece. Jacob gets more children through Bilhah, and Bilhah gives Jacob Dan, who is the fifth born, because we left it at the fourth born. We left it at Judah in chapter 29. So she gives birth to the fifth son, to Jacob, who is Dan. And Dan means judgment, or he judged, or God has judged me. Then Bilhah conceives again and gives birth to the sixth son, who is named Naphtali by Rachel. And Naphtali means win through wrestling. She's like, I have wrestled with my sister and God has made me to prevail. So she calls him Naphtali. In verse 9 to 13, when Leah saw what Rachel did, she also follows suit and promotes her maid Zilpah to become the fourth wife of Jacob. So Jacob gets more children through Zilpah. And she gave birth to Gad, who is the son number seven, Gad, which means luck, fortune, or fortunate. I am fortunate, Gad. Nowadays, you will hear people praying, and instead of saying God, there are people who say God. That's terrible. Maybe it's a problem of pronunciation. But it's not good to call God Gad. Okay, Gad is a son of Jacob. Then she conceived again and bore a son, and Leah named this child Asher, which means happy or blessed. I am now happy. In verse 14 to 16, we see competition and over competition and conception over mandrakes. So we are told that it was during the time of wheat harvest. So Reuben goes out and finds mandrakes in the fields, and he brings them home to the mother, who is Leah. And we see a huge competition here. Now the Hebrew word for mandrakes is dudaim. Some people have said it means love plants, or it is rendered as violets plants. Violets, lilies, maybe jasmines or truffles or mushrooms or flowers or citron. They say that mandrakes are a symbol of fertility, love, and fulfillment. Now these mandrakes are also mentioned in the Song of Solomon, chapter 7, verse 13. So Rachel is like, here are the love plants. I want to be fertile. I want to give more children to my husband Jacob. So she really needs them. And she thinks that maybe through them, Jacob will love him, will love her, and she will be able to conceive. So there is a tussle there. They're asking, you've taken away my husband. Do you also want to... Leah is saying, you've taken my husband. Do you also want to take my son's mandrakes? And Rachel got a plan and said, you can have Jacob tonight, and then please give me the mandrakes. Then we are told that God heard the prayer of Leah. Leah seized the moment for that. Leah gave the mandrakes, and then Jacob was his for that night. And I was like, I hope Reuben did not overhear that conversation. It was a funny conversation. I hope he did not overhear that conversation. But again, he must have been wondering, what have I done? Now, these two, my mother and this co-wife of my father, are here, just exchanging words over mandrakes. So he was wondering, but I hope he went away and didn't hear what the ladies were talking about. So Leah got to be with Jacob that night, and we are told in verse 17 to 21, God listened to Leah, and that's a good thing. She was praying to conceive and bear children. Remember in Genesis 29 verse 31, we were told that God saw that she was not loved. But here we see God hearing her prayers. She's praying, and God gave her children through Jacob. So she conceived and bore 3 children. The first one was Issachar, and that was child number 10 through the four wives. Child number 10 was Issachar, and Issachar was Leah's 5th son. The 4th one was Judah. Now he's gotten number 5, Issachar. And Issachar means my hire, or man of hire, or my reward, because he had given away the mandrakes to have Jacob, and so that Rachel would have the mandrakes. Then she conceived again, named the child Zebulun. This was her 6th son, but child number 11 in this whole family. And he said Zebulun. She said Zebulun, which means one who dwells, or to dwell, because she's like, Jacob will dwell with me, not Rachel, because I have given him more children. Then she conceived again and gave birth to her 7th and only daughter, and the only daughter in this home, this big family. This is her 7th child, and she called her Dinah. And Dinah means judged or vindicated. So that's beautiful. From verse 22 to 24, God remembered and answered Rachel's prayer. Now, Rachel, remember in verse 1, she's talking to Jacob, give me children or I die. Then she gives her maid to Jacob. But here, she has now learned her lesson. She has turned to God. Maybe she observed Leah and she was like, yeah, I need to go to God. So there is a change here. She turns to God because she's like, yeah, God is the one who can give me children. And God answered her prayer. And this time it was not through the maid. She actually conceived and gave birth to her first biological child. And she named him Joseph. Joseph. And Joseph means God will add, or he will add. Because she said, God will give me another son. Yeah, so as we've gone through chapter 29 and 30, looking at the different children and the meanings of their names, I hope for those who don't yet have children, you've gotten maybe some names to name your children. That's a joke. But you can also get some names from there. So from here we see that the unloved wife got 7 children, 6 sons and 1 daughter. And the one who was more loved got just 1 son. I think that says something about the justice of God. So both the new wives who were maids before, they each got two children. I realized from chapter 29 and 30 that it is actually the wives who are naming the children. Imagine that. I know in our African culture it is the men who are supposed to name the children. But here, Jacob does not name even 1 child. It is the 2 ladies, Rachel and Leah. They name all the children. And that's important. Then, I noted in chapter 29 and 30 that Jacob is still, he's obeying what his wives are saying. He's really into giving them more children. You know, it was that season of having children. He's not saying much. Maybe he has learned his lessons. Maybe he has worked with Laban and is like, maybe he looked at how the wives were competing and maybe they used to exchange words, and he was like, I don't want this trouble. So he's just quiet, and the children are born. Maybe. Then in verse 25 to 43, Jacob wants to leave now, and he wants to leave with everything he owns, but Laban stresses that, please stay longer with me, don't go yet. Then he asks again, what will be your reward? And Jacob schemes again and talks about, he gets more flocks, and he says, my wages will be the speckled, the spotted, the brown flocks. And then he got more and the strong sheep, lambs, and goats through these rods that he made. So he first chose among the already existing, he separated them, and then with the ones that were being conceived, he used this method of breeding with the rods. And so he used to get the strong ones, and then the weak ones would go to Laban. He was really a man of tricks. So he used a breeding program or method of rods. And I read that method is still being used today in some areas. Not maybe for the same purposes, but for purposes of increasing the herds, the flocks. In verse 27, Laban acknowledges that God has blessed him because Jacob has been with him. You know, I had little when you came, now I have more. He acknowledges that really Jacob has brought more blessings to him, and he has increased. Then in verse 30, Jacob responds and says that the Lord has blessed you since my coming. And that's important to note and to ask ourselves where we are. Does my presence bring blessings to the people who I am with? Are you a channel of God's blessings to others, or do you keep the blessings to yourself? And let us remember that the greatest blessing we can be to other people is to bring them to Christ for salvation, as faithful witnesses of Christ. So are people being blessed because you are with them? Does your presence bring grace and blessings to people? May the Lord help us to be channels of blessing, so that people can say, when we were with so-and-so, we really saw God doing things. You know, His presence here made a difference. May that be said of us, all of us. Now remember, we are blessed to be a blessing. That is what God told Abraham, Genesis 12. We are not blessed to stay blessed. We are not blessed to boast. We are not blessed to keep them to ourselves. We are blessed to be a blessing. So be a channel of God's blessings to the people around you. The last verse, 43, tells us that the man became exceedingly prosperous. Jacob, he became exceedingly prosperous. And that reminds me that he has become as prosperous as his father Isaac. Because the Bible told us in Genesis 26, verse 13, that the man, this is Isaac, began to prosper and continued prospering until he became very prosperous. Now his son Jacob is exceedingly prosperous. Isn't that a wonderful thing? Awesome. So that is Genesis chapter 30. We still have 20 chapters to go to finish the book of Genesis, and we believe God will grant us the grace, life, and health to be able to do that, even as we look forward, by the grace of God, to doing this all the way to the book of Revelation, the last chapter. What does Genesis chapter 30 tell us about God? Number one, God fulfills his promises. God is bringing about here the tribes of Israel, and this nation of Israel would become the channel of him blessing all the families of the earth with salvation through Christ Jesus. God has an eternal plan to save mankind, and he's working it out bit by bit, and here through the birth of these 12 sons. Secondly, God hears and answers prayers. These ladies are praying, and God is answering their prayers. 3, God is in charge of all that happens in our lives. God is in control of history. He's controlling all these things to happen, and he has a clear plan. There is nothing that happens that God is not aware about. There is nothing that happens without his knowledge or his permission on the earth, on the universe. Lastly, God is all powerful. He's all powerful. He closes, he opens wombs, and he does amazing things. Some applications for us: we should be more passionate for the glory of God among the nations. Let us remember, because we are the sons and daughters of Abraham, the promise for all the families of the earth to be blessed through him is still happening. As people get saved and they become sons and daughters of Abraham, God is still continuing to increase the descendants of Abraham, those that come to him in faith. Those who've never heard of Christ's love, they need to hear it. We need to be involved in evangelism. We need to send laborers. We need to pray for laborers. We need to go on mission for God. We need to partner so that many people can come to Christ. We can enlarge the kingdom of God by helping so that many can become the children of God, or disciples or followers of Christ. Let's be more passionate. Let's tell God, Father, give us this tribe. God, give us this country, or we die. You know, we can pray such dangerous prayers like Rachel or John Knox. Secondly, we should trust God in prayer. These ladies trusted God. Rachel began badly, thinking that it is her husband or she can get through her maid, but she realized it is through prayer, and God did that. We can trust God. Then lastly, it is good for us to be a blessing to others. Be a blessing to people. Release people. Let them go out. Let them blossom. Don't envy them. Don't be jealous. Let them thrive, even as we help them in one way or the other. And you said the best way we can help, be a blessing to people, is by preaching to them the gospel, for them to become children of God. May the Lord bless you. Have a wonderful time. See you next week as we go to Genesis chapter 31. Shalom.